All right, it is now the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Coral Owen. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the Military Families Learning Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. This learning opportunity is brought to you by the Nutrition and Wellness Concentration Area of the Military Families Learning Network. The webinar resources, including today's webinar slides, can be found at the learn.extension.org link that is located in the chat pod in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Additionally, if you have need of tech support during today's webinar, either type in the chat pod or the better recommendation would be to email us at our Military Families Learning Network email address, which is located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So this will be available for reference throughout today's webinar. The Military Families Learning Network, partnership for military families, connecting military family service providers and cooperative extension professionals to research and to each other through engaging online learning opportunities. You can explore more about our communities and our resources at militaryfamilies.extension.org. Also, we invite you to engage with us on Facebook, Twitter, as well as check out our archive of our professional development sessions on YouTube. Also, you can sign up for email notifications if you're not yet receiving those at militaryfamilies.extension.org/webinars. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Robin Allen, who is the Social Media Specialist for the Nutrition and Wellness Concentration Area. Robin has been a registered dietitian for over 30 years and is also a retired captain from the Navy, where she started her dietitian's career. Thanks, Robin. Robin, we're not able to hear you. If you want to check your mute button real quick. All right, Robin, looks like Robin is having a microphone malfunction. So it is my pleasure to introduce Amy Jones, who is our facilitator this morning. Amy founded and leads the Logan County Celiac Support Group in Bellefontaine, Ohio. She is also a regular contributor to Gluten-free Living magazine and serves on the magazine's dietetic advisory board. She's also the chair of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and then she also has research interest in celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So Amy, thanks again for joining us this morning, and it is my pleasure to turn things over to you.
Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. I really appreciate you guys spending an hour of what I know sometimes is a busy day. Hello from somewhat warm Ohio. I understand in the Northeast it's not quite this warm, so hope the weather is good wherever you are. And I'm hoping that everyone can hear. So I'm going to do my best. I'm a pretty informal presenter. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat pod. So if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and type those. I may not address them at the time that you type them, just because I may hit it later. If I don't hit it, the questions by the end, again, feel free to ask those, and I'll try to leave about 5 minutes at the end for any questions or discussion, and then I'm sure we can do some type of follow-up. So I'll go ahead and get started because we've got a lot to cover today. So gluten-free is hot. I think you all know that. If you've been working in this area for any length of time, you're hearing it just like I'm hearing it. But what is the real information, and what can we pass on to our patients? So a little bit of where we're going today. I want to give you a little celiac disease 101 and a little bit about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, because I think that's probably the more confusing condition, because we end up seeing patients who claim that they're gluten sensitive, and what does that really mean, and is there a test for that, and how can we get that that good information to our patients. We're talking a little bit about the fad of gluten-free, and like I said, gluten-free is hot right now. We're seeing celebrities and athletes, and again, it's everywhere. We're going to talk a little bit about the gluten-free labeling rule. The labeling rule was passed in 2013 and went into effect in 2014. You're probably starting to see products that are labeled gluten-free, but what does that mean? And then we're going to talk about what I think is probably the most challenging thing for my patients is eating away from home. Most of my patients can get a handle on what they do in the house, but when they leave the home, when they go to restaurants or to weddings, how do they handle that? And then we're also going to talk about food intolerances that could cause what we call non-responsive celiac disease. So, things like FODMAPs and lactose. So we're going to cover those at the end. So a little bit about what celiac disease is, and again, you're probably well aware of this, but it's always good to review the exact etiology of the disease. So it's an inherited autoimmune disorder. Of course, you know what autoimmune disorders are, but it's also inherited, so there's a genetic link, and we'll talk about that. When a person with celiac disease ingests gluten from wheat or those related proteins that are in barley and rye, the body triggers what we call an immune reaction. So unlike a food allergy where, your body attacks the allergen, when somebody has celiac disease, the body attacks itself. And what part of the body that it attacks is that villi of the small intestine. And as I always like to describe to my patients, the villi of the small intestine should look like shag carpet, I guess is the best way to describe it. And when they have celiac disease, particularly celiac disease that is, somewhat advanced at the time of diagnosis, it looks a lot like Berber carpeting. So those villi are flattened. We thought it was rare. And I have to say I'm not that old of a dietitian yet. I mean, I've been practicing for about 15 years. But when I was in college, I was told that I would not see this unless I worked in a pediatric hospital. So, here's what it is, but you're not really going to need to know this. But now we know the prevalence is much larger than we thought it was. So we think about 1 in 100 people. Sometimes you'll see the statistic 1 in 133. So about 1 in 100, about 1% of the population. The interesting thing is this now includes people of all ages. Again, we used to think this was a pediatric condition. The majority of people, however, and we think about 8 out of 10 who actually have celiac disease, don't know they have it. So not unlike diabetes, where we have lots of people who are undiagnosed diabetics walking around, we have a lot of people who have undiagnosed celiac disease walking around as well. The problem with this is that, of course, with celiac disease, there's lots of symptoms that can overlap with a lot of other conditions. And as I like to tell my patients, sometimes they get thrown under the IBS bus, the irritable bowel syndrome bus, and their doctor says, well, you're having belly problems, so it must be IBS. And sometimes they don't dig a little bit further. So again, that overlapping of symptoms can be a problem. And again, the majority of adults don't actually even present now with that classic GI symptoms. Some of them do, of course, but some of them come with other medical conditions that are related to that malabsorption caused by celiac disease, but they don't always present with what we expect with weight loss and diarrhea. So the dietary triggers, we know wheat, rye, barley, non-gluten-free oats, and we'll talk a little bit about oats soon, and then brewer's yeast. And right now, the only treatment for celiac disease is 100% gluten-free diet for life. There are, I believe, other treatments coming down the pike, and I think fairly soon. I think at some point celiac disease will be like diabetes, where there'll be a dietary component and there will be a medication component. There are medications in testing right now that may be helpful to those with celiac disease. There are some vaccine trials going on, and it wouldn't be like a vaccine, like a childhood vaccine. It would be similar to like an allergy shot that may also help sensitize those folks to gluten. Again, those things are all in trials right now, all in development, so watch this space. So we're going to do a little bit of a poll question here. And again, I will be very curious to see what you all are hearing in practice. Besides celiac disease, what is the most frequent reason you hear given for trying the gluten-free diet? And I'll give you about 15 seconds to get your answers in here. I'm seeing in the chat pot, weight loss, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, so the general best answer that we're seeing is people say they think it's healthier or they're going to think it's going to help them lose weight. I hear that a lot. I also hear, I think I just feel better off of gluten. Again, you may have heard that as well. All right. So let's talk about who should be tested. These are the most common symptoms of celiac disease, but like I said, these are very overlapping symptoms. I mean, you might look at this and think, I have 3 of these. You know, I often do that. I think, oh my goodness, I have a lot of these. But it doesn't mean that because you have one of these symptoms, you have celiac disease, and it doesn't mean that because you don't have any of these symptoms that you don't have celiac disease. But these are the most common ones we see. So the classic GI symptoms of weight loss, diarrhea, cramps, bloating. In children, we see poor growth. The funny thing is, once kids get on the gluten-free diet who have celiac disease, they tend to shoot up on the growth curve. Anemia is very common if you think about malabsorption and the resulting anemia, nausea and vomiting, migraines. It's very interesting. We're seeing migraine headaches as a symptom of celiac disease. Osteoporosis or osteopenia in somebody who, perhaps shouldn't have it at that age can be an indication. There are neurological symptoms, neuropathy and ataxia. Those are kind of new things that we're looking at, but there are neurological symptoms. Elevated liver enzymes, and that's something I've actually seen a couple of times in clinical practice where people have come in with newly diagnosed celiac disease who have elevated liver enzymes. And once we get the celiac disease under control, those liver enzymes go down. And then, of course, there's what we call the rash version of celiac disease. It's called dermatitis herpetiformis, or DH for short. DH is a very intensely itchy rash that occurs on the knees and the elbows. And the only thing that helps that rash is the gluten-free diet. There are medications that people can take, but they don't really treat the rash. And so those folks come in and they can get a biopsy of their skin, and if we see IgA deposits in their skin, they can be diagnosed with celiac disease. So who else should be tested? So those with first-degree relatives, and of course that makes sense because this is an inherited condition that if you have a parent with celiac disease, you might have celiac disease as well. Those with related conditions, type 1 diabetes. It is estimated that between 6 and 10% of people with type 1 diabetes will at some point go on to develop celiac disease. Very interesting stuff. Those with autoimmune thyroid disease are at increased risk for celiac disease. Down syndromes, Turner syndrome, all these other developmental conditions, Sjogren's syndrome, should also all be tested for celiac disease. So how do we put together that puzzle? I'm a puzzle fiend. I have to tell you, jigsaw puzzles are probably one of my favorite hobbies. And I like to think of celiac disease as a puzzle, because if you don't have all the pieces, it doesn't work. So our puzzle pieces include serological testing, so blood testing for antibodies, EGD with biopsies, and that is still the gold standard, and we'll talk about that. And then, of course, responding to the gluten-free diet. So the most common serological test that you'll see run is something called the tissue transglutaminase IgA, or TTG for short. The pros of this test are it's very low cost and it's very specific to celiac disease. So again, very good to know if somebody has a high TTG, very likely they do have celiac disease. The cons are that the TTG may be elevated due to other conditions. For example, children with type 1 diabetes can have what we sort of transient or just short-term elevations in their TTG, and it does not indicate they have celiac disease. It is also not accurate in children under the age of 2. The most important thing too to know is that a total IgA must be measured at the same time the TTG is measured. The reason being is about 2 to 5% of those with celiac disease are what we call IgA deficient. And because they're IgA deficient, that TTG will not be accurate. So again, when you get blood tests back from doctor's offices and you're taking a look at a patient's labs and you say, okay, what did they run? The TTG and the IgA are the ones that you will most likely see. There are a couple of other tests that are available, although these are a little less common. The endomysial antibodies are very specific to celiac disease. Almost 100% of those with a positive EMA will have celiac disease. However, it's a higher cost and it's a higher risk for lab error. It's not as sensitive as TTGs, so again, somebody with celiac disease might even have a negative EMA, so it's not as diagnostic as the TTG is. And the deaminated gliadin peptides, I don't see that run a lot where I work, but the DGP is really good for kids. It's good in diagnosing those who have IgA deficiency as well. Older tests, like the anti-gliadin antibodies, IgA, IgG, are not useful for diagnosing celiac disease. They're not particularly sensitive. They're not particularly specific. So here's the thing, though. You can't put the cart ahead of the horse. It is very important that we get our patients screened for celiac disease before we have them go gluten-free. And this is really becoming very tricky because of the fad of gluten-free, or unfortunately even physicians saying, oh, just try the diet, or they watch a television show and end up trying the diet because they think it's going to work for them. All of these serological tests are dependent on gluten in the diet. So if your patient has come in and they've been eating gluten-free for 6 months, they do risk a false negative screening result. So it's really important that if you do talk to a patient who wants to quote-unquote try the diet, that you say, you know what, and I give examples from my own group. I say I have patients who end up not knowing what they have. They end up not knowing if they have celiac disease because, they're unwilling to eat gluten again because they feel so good on the gluten-free diet that you really put yourself in a position that you don't want to be. I did mention that celiac disease is inherited, and we know the role of celiac, those gene roles in celiac disease really, really well. We know that almost everyone, like 99.6% or something, of those with celiac disease carry one of two genes. So HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8 or both. So they have one of these two genes. And again, because that primary relative who has celiac disease increases the chances of developing it, again, anyone who has a first-degree relative should be screened for celiac disease. The problem with this is that 30 to 40% of the general population carries one of those two genes, but only 1% will actually go on to develop it. So having the gene does not mean that you're going to get celiac disease. It just means that you could. So it's very limited in a sort of a diagnostic role for those with celiac disease. I do have a good question. It says, what type of doctor should be running these tests? Does a primary care physician needs to do it? Do you need a specialist? Anyone, any primary care or a specialist or a GI doctor could run those two serological tests. And then I always say they should be referred on. We're going to talk about the role of EGD, but the primary care provider is a great person to start with those tests. So why would we want to gene test at all? Why would we care? If they have celiac disease, we know they have one of those two genes. It can be helpful to rule out the condition. So for example, let's say you have a patient that comes to you and they say, I've been gluten-free for 2 years and I feel wonderful and I don't want to go back at eating gluten to get tested. What can I do? And that would be an indication where a doctor could run a genetic test. If they don't have the gene, they likely don't have celiac disease. Now, they could be non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but they very most likely, in all probabilities, do not have celiac disease if they don't carry one of the genes. The nice thing is, especially for families, perhaps have 3 or 4 children, and a parent who has celiac disease and they would like to have to not to test the kids every few years, they could always run the genetic test on those children. And again, if only 2 of the kids have the gene, then the other 2 don't need to be tested year after year. The gluten challenge, which is, again, somebody who comes to you gluten-free, how long do they have to eat gluten to be tested? It varies from center to center. The University of Chicago has their own guidelines. The University of Massachusetts has their own guidelines. The gluten challenge generally involves 1 to 2 slices of bread a day for a few weeks. And again, a few weeks could be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on the center where the person is being tested. The other thing to remember is a positive genetic test does not mean that the patient should be on the gluten-free diet. So again, just because they have the gene, and this is something you want to explain to your patients, just because they have the gene for celiac disease does not mean that they're going to get it or that it's somehow inevitable that they're going to get it. And it doesn't mean they should be gluten-free. And because we said no serological test is perfect. Remember, it's very sensitive, but it's not perfect. The gold standard is for diagnosis remains an endoscopy with biopsies. So we want to look for, and the doctor's going to be looking for anything that's those intraepithelial lymphocytes to maybe that more severe villus atrophy. Remember Marsh, or we talk a little bit about that. They talk about Marsh classifications, but I always like to think in sort of carpet, so that, villi that looks like shag carpeting versus something that looks like Berber. The doctor performing the biopsies should take several samples from the duodenum. The problem is that celiac disease can be a little bit patchy, and it might not be throughout the entire duodenum. So if they only take 1 or 2 samples, good chances they might miss that damage. So they should take several samples throughout the duodenum. The other condition we're going to talk about is this non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And like I said, because we have very good parameters for diagnosing celiac disease, blood work, biopsy, genetic test, we have way fewer options for those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. However, if you go online, I'm sure many companies will be happy to sell you a stool test or a saliva test to test for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. What's important to know is there is no valid biomarker for the diagnosis of NCGS. So again, if you have a patient saying, I got tested for that, unfortunately they didn't. There is no test for it at this point. The diagnosis for celiac disease, we used to use the word like exclusion, but really what we want them to do is eliminate and then re-challenge once celiac disease and wheat allergy have been ruled out. So the diagnosis would be made by eliminating gluten from the diet for a few weeks and then re-challenging. The other thing to, again, remember is you want to rule out celiac disease and wheat allergy. So again, once you've done the other tests, let's say those TTG tests come back negative, and they say, well, I still think I have an issue with gluten. Yeah, then that's the time to go ahead and eliminate gluten from the diet for a few weeks and then re-challenge it. There is some controversy on whether gluten is the real culprit here. Very interesting research that has come out in the area of FODMAPs. We'll talk about FODMAPs at the end. But those short-chain carbohydrates, there is some thought that perhaps that's what people who are gluten sensitive are actually intolerant to. But there was a recent study done in 2016 that showed that there is an immune reaction to those to gluten in those with NCGS. So I don't think, as much as we hear this in the media, that this is a made-up condition. It is not. We do know from recent research, as Dr. Peter Green, that there is an immune reaction to those with NCGS. We just don't know what the immune reaction is. So the differences, and this is kind of a good column, a good way to kind of look at it, kind of lay out the two conditions. Celiac disease has a defined genetic marker. We know how to test for it. We do need to know which one our patient has, and I spend a lot of time explaining this to patients, that it's important to know. And how I always put it is, you would never start insulin if you didn't know for sure you are a diabetic. Same kind of thing here. You don't start this diet, which is really a life-changing diet, without knowing what you have. So we talk about that defined genetic marker, identifiable villi damage. For those who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, we know there is no defined genetic marker. There's no serological test. We don't think there's any villi damage. We don't think there's an immune response, or there's unclear what the immune response is, but there is likely one, and long-term complications are probably not happening with somebody with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but we're also just starting to study gluten sensitivity, so we don't know if there are long-term complications, but we think likely not. Terry asked, are those tests covered under insurance plans? The TTG and the IgA should be covered. Again, I think it would obviously depend on the person's clinical history, whether the physician could justify those getting covered. Genetic tests may or may not be covered. So why else would somebody want to go gluten-free? There is some evidence that those with IBD, Crohn's disease, might see some symptom benefit, although the research study talk about symptom benefit only. They don't talk about remission. So if you're having a patient who has Crohn's disease and they're wanting to try gluten-free diets, you might find that they might feel better, or they might find that they might feel better, but they're not going to somehow keep themselves in remission by being gluten-free. Others might try it for other autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, thyroid disease, as well as other behavioral conditions. We see some thought about ADHD and autism, but there just is not strong, conclusive research that there are benefits in any of these populations. You will hear anecdotal stories all the time. You'll hear that somebody became gluten-free and their rheumatoid arthritis was much, much better. And again, they actually may have celiac disease along with it. Again, the key is that they also get screened for celiac disease. It is important to remember that there is an increased risk of thyroid disease in those with celiac disease. So somebody who has celiac disease is at increased risk for getting celiac disease, or for thyroid disease for getting celiac disease. So who else is eating gluten-free? And of course, we know it's a big fad. Between 2004 and 2011, the market really grew at an annual rate of 28%, which is really unheard of. We look at $2.6 billion in sales of gluten-free products in 2012, up to $6.6 billion this year. An interesting study, that 2013, a study that found 30% of Americans showed interest in avoiding gluten, and yet another 2013 study found that 65% of Americans think gluten-free foods are healthier, and 27% chose those foods to help them lose weight. And of course, we know that's not the case, but why do they think that? There was a 2015 study done in adult patients with celiac disease, and that found that 11% had at some point avoided gluten without a diagnosis. So the reasons they gave to the researchers were maybe irritable bowel syndrome or lactose intolerance. And then even kids, we're finding that kids are avoiding gluten without, probably more likely their parents, without a diagnosis of celiac disease. So a 2012 study found that 8% were avoiding gluten without celiac disease. So again, diarrhea, autism, family history of celiac disease, and behavioral changes. So we hear it in the media. We hear celebrities. We hear athletes who say that gluten-free has improved their performance or it's helped with their weight. We look at diet books and celebrity physicians. Somebody mentioned in the chat pod Grain Brain, which is not my favorite book. But there is, thought on, oh goodness, gluten is going to cause dementia. And again, there just is not strong research behind any of those statements. And I think it's the responsibility of the RDN to provide that factual information. So how can we do that? So are there risks to eating gluten-free? There are nutritional deficiencies for those on the gluten-free diet. So B vitamins, iron, fiber, trace minerals. Gluten-free grains are not always enriched. In fact, most of the time they're not. Good luck trying to find a loaf of gluten-free bread that is enriched. Individuals may fail to meet grain serving guidelines. So we look at people who are eating 1 to 2 servings of grain per day instead of recommended amounts. There was a study done at a celiac conference back in 2011 that I cited here that found that people who were eating gluten-free were eating less than 1 grain serving per day. Somebody asked if I have a citation for the nutritional deficiencies. All my references are at the end, so you'll be able to see that. And then we know it's expensive. A 2015 study found that gluten-free bakery and bread products were 267% more expensive than regular, and gluten-free cereals are 205% more expensive. So again, there's a real expense. So let's put it into practice. We have Mr. Keller who comes to your office and he says he wants to learn more about the gluten-free diet. He read online that wheat causes diarrhea, and he does admit to having stomach issues for many years. He said he wanted to try the gluten-free diet for a week, or he did try it, and he felt a lot better. What's the most appropriate thing for you to do? I'll let people kind of go ahead and answer that in the chat pod. So, Amy, I don't know if you can hear me. This is Robin. I'll give you another couple seconds. Everybody's typing. Yep, absolutely. Get those labs ordered. A week into it isn't going to sink the ship, but if he goes gluten-free for 6 months, we're in trouble. So it's very important that he get tested before he get too much further into it. So let's move on to that gluten-free labeling rule. In August 2013, the FDA issued the final rule for the voluntary labeling of food is labeled gluten-free. This rule went into full effect in August of 2014. So this rule applies to our packaged foods that are regulated by the FDA. It also applies to dietary supplements. This does not apply to meat. It does not apply to alcoholic beverages. It does not apply to over-the-counter or prescribed medications. So the definition of gluten-free, for a food to be labeled gluten-free, it must contain less than 20 parts per million gluten. And we'll talk about what parts per million are. But parts per million is a concentration. It's not an exact amount. So it's not like, saturated fat, 3 grams. It is a concentration of gluten per parts million, so less than 20 parts per million. So the way I tell people to think about this is if I gave you a bag of 1 million blue marbles, but instead of giving you 1 million blue marbles, I gave you 999,980 blue marbles and 20 red marbles. You could say your bag was contaminated with 20 parts per million of red marbles. So same kind of thing, there's that concentration. This includes ingredients and accidental cross-contact with gluten in the fields, transport, manufacturing, or packaging. And this is a little bit different than food allergy labeling. So we all are probably familiar with FALPCA, that Food Allergy Labeling and Protection Act, where something says contains wheat or contains soy or contains eggs. That only applies to ingredients. This applies to everything. So again, manufacturing, cross-contact in fields and in transport. So what can be labeled gluten-free? Any naturally gluten-free food like grapefruit or bottled water could be labeled gluten-free, and we'll talk about that because that sometimes doesn't make sense. Somebody's labeling bottled water gluten-free, that doesn't make any sense, but we'll talk about that. Not made from a gluten-containing grain, so not made from wheat, not made from barley, not made from a gluten-containing grain that has not otherwise been processed to remove gluten, so for example, wheat flour. It may have a gluten-containing grain that has been processed to remove gluten, and the one we will cite today is called wheat starch, but that final product still must be less than 20 parts per million of gluten. Other words you might see would be free of gluten, without gluten, and no gluten. So if you see that on a package, you know they must comply with the gluten-free labeling of that less than 20 parts per million. Here's where the one that gets tricky. So made with no gluten-containing ingredients or not made with gluten-containing ingredients, they can put that on packaging, but it does not have to equal gluten-free. It does not have to comply with that rule, again, unless that gluten-free claim is also made. If you see words like low gluten or reduced gluten, those are not regulated terms. So again, you might see terms like free from gluten, without gluten, and no gluten. So why not 0? Why is 20 parts per million okay? You might think, well, that just seems high, doesn't it? There are no analytical methods available for that are scientifically validated to test for the presence of gluten at less than 20 parts per million. So if you see something that says 0 parts per million gluten, they're not being truthful because, again, there's no way to test for anything that would be less than 20 parts per million according to the FDA. The other thing to remember is that 20 parts per million is considered the standard level of gluten that is tolerated by most people with celiac disease. So it's still a very small amount of gluten, very small amount. Crumbs are what we're talking about here. But we know that people with celiac disease can tolerate a very, very small amount. We did have a question. These are front of package claims. That is correct. They are on the front of the package. The 20 parts per million is also in line with what other countries have done. Other countries are a little bit ahead of the United States on gluten-free labeling, and 20 parts per million has been the standard sort of all around the world. The good news is that most gluten-free foods test much lower. The Gluten-free Watchdog, which is an independent testing organization that's run by a colleague of mine, published a study in 2013 which showed that 97.5% of the products that she tested were below 20 parts per million. And she uses a test that does allow her to go below 5 parts per million, and 93% of them were even below that. The FDA recognizes the 20 parts per million test. If you're asking, well, how can she test that way if the FDA can't? She's using a slightly different test than the FDA is using. The takeaway from this, and this is what you can reassure your patients, the vast majority of products labeled gluten-free already test at exceedingly low levels of gluten, so much less than 20 parts per million. So if they say, well, I can't eat that because I can't have 20 parts per million, it's, again, most of them test much, much lower than that. The vast majority do. If you're interested more in Gluten-free Watchdog, I encourage you to visit the website. Lots of good independent testing. If you're wondering about different products, if you want a product tested, the dietitian there will do that. It's very, very good information. So here's where it gets interesting. The FDA says that manufacturers are not required to test for the presence of gluten before making the label claim. And you might think, well, how does that work? If they don't have to test, how do they know? Well, that might be confusing. The FDA states that the manufacturers who choose to use the gluten-free label claim are responsible for making sure that that label claim meets the final requirements of that rule. So if they don't test for it, they can't know. But the FDA is not prescriptive of how they necessarily need to test. The FDA says that manufacturers may figure out whether they're less than 20 parts per million by conducting in-house testing, having a third-party laboratory do in-house gluten testing, requesting certificates of gluten analysis from ingredient suppliers, or even participating in a third-party certification program. And we'll talk about those. Some confusing ingredients you might see come up. The FDA says that the malt extract and malt cannot be considered ingredients processed to remove gluten and are not permitted. And of course, malt and malt extract come from barley primarily. Cannot be included on items labeled gluten-free, even if the final product contains 20 parts per million gluten or less. This is a really controversial point for manufacturers. We have a handful of manufacturers right now who still are putting a gluten-free label claim on up front of a package and then still have malt in the ingredients list. And again, that is not allowed. The FDA has stated on multiple occasions that that is not permitted. So if you see a package, let's say a patient brings in a package of granola bars and it says gluten-free on the front and then on the back it says malt extract, that is a mislabeled product. It should be reported to the FDA. And then oats. Oats are not considered a gluten-containing grain under the new rule. So regular oats are still at great risk for cross-contamination. So even though they're not considered gluten-containing, that does not mean regular oats are now suddenly safe for people with celiac disease. So it is still recommended that those with celiac disease purchase oats labeled gluten-free. Oats themselves don't contain gluten. The problem with oats, and particularly the way they're grown in this country, is that they are grown right alongside wheat fields. They are perhaps rotated fields between wheat crops and then oat crops. There's lots of risk for contamination with wheat and with barley. So it's still very much recommended that we purchase oats labeled gluten-free. This is also a controversial subject, and I could do an entire webinar on just gluten-free oats because it's really a hot topic right now in the gluten-free world. But the different methods that manufacturers use to get to those gluten-free oats are quite controversial. So whether they're mechanically sorting them or buying oats that are grown in dedicated fields. And then those naturally gluten-free foods, and I think I mentioned a few slides ago about bottled water being labeled gluten-free, and again, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But that doesn't mean that you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense that they would want to be able to naturally, label those naturally gluten-free foods. But if you think about it, for example, let's say chocolate milk. Well, chocolate milk is highly unlikely to contain any gluten. but it looks like we're back on. I did see one question in the chat pod before everything went dark about why malt cannot be in products labeled gluten-free, even if the final product is less than 20 parts per million. It's a little bit about how the testing is done. Malt has to be tested, or products with malt have to be tested in a different way with a different gluten test. And that test may or may not pick up all those fermented and hydrolyzed ingredients, of which malt is one. And so we don't at this point have a valid test that we know for sure can pick up gluten in ingredients that have malt, or in products that have malt. Okay, so let's go back to those natural gluten-free foods. And like I said, you may see bottled water with that label gluten-free. The reason I said about, I think before everything went dark, we talked about chocolate milk. The example given was that, all chocolate milk would generally be gluten-free, except if that chocolate milk happened to be flavored with malt. And so naturally gluten-free foods can have that gluten-free label just to protect against situations like that. So again, someone might assume that all milk is gluten-free, and 99.9% of the time it is. But there may be a situation where there might be gluten in a milk product. So those naturally gluten-free foods, the FDA has determined can carry that label. But does that mean that people with celiac disease should buy only bottled water that is labeled gluten-free? Of course not. That doesn't make any sense. You want to look at foods that are at low risk for contamination. So bottled water would be one of those. Carrots would be one of those. And they don't need to be labeled gluten-free. Gluten-free grains, however, are at risk for contamination. Again, it's just how they're grown. So things like amaranth and buckwheat, mixed food products with naturally gluten-free grains like corn tortillas, buckwheat noodles should be labeled gluten-free. There are studies that show that these grains are at high risk of contamination, higher risk than other naturally gluten-free foods, like, for example, bottled water. So those should be labeled gluten-free. One thing we want to look at is those ingredients processed to remove gluten. And the one thing the FDA cited was the ingredient wheat starch. Wheat starch is a product that contains very little of that protein, that gluten protein, and so it could be included in a product without raising the concentration of gluten to above 20 parts per million. However, the FDA also understands this is a confusing statement to have something that says wheat starch on the back and then gluten-free on the front. How does that look to the consumer? So there must be a qualifying statement on products. This wheat has been processed to allow this food to meet FDA requirements for gluten-free foods, and that must be on the package as well. Right now, I don't know of a lot of products, and maybe you have seen them, but I have not, that contain wheat starch that also have a gluten-free label. It's actually a little bit difficult to find gluten-free wheat starch in the United States. Then third-party certifications. Manufacturers may use symbols like this, and you might have already seen them. That black circle with the GF in the middle, that is from the Gluten-Free Certifying Organization, GFCO. The one below that is from another organization. And the FDA says you can use these symbols, but they have to be truthful and not misleading. It is not necessary, though, for your patients to buy only products that have these symbols. And I have patients who are very, I'm only going to buy something that has the GF and the circle. It's not necessary for them to do that. It can provide an added measure of security in the fact that we know that those products have been tested, because to get that symbol, they are tested and they are inspected, but it is not necessary. And then those are those confusing allergen advisory statements, and we've all seen them, and we've all had trouble ourselves just even interpreting them. That processed in a facility that processes wheat, or maybe made on shared equipment or made in a shared facility. This is a confusing point for both patients and clinicians. I have patients who say they will not eat products that have allergen advisory statements on them, and I think that's probably unnecessary avoidance. The other thing to remember is that allergen advisory statements are voluntary on the part of the manufacturer. So just because product A has that statement and product B does not, it does not mean that product A is not safe and product B is safe. That's a voluntary statement. So unlike contains wheat or contains egg, Those are voluntary statements. It does not take the place of good manufacturing practices, so like cleaning equipment or having allergen control plans in place. So I have lots of patients who say, oh, the manufacturers are just covering themselves by putting that statement on the package. And that's not the case at all. They are alerting you, but again, it's a voluntary alert. And the other thing is it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have to clean their equipment or have an allergen control plan in place to protect someone. So I always say to tell patients, it is not necessary. And in fact, research doesn't even support avoiding those products because, again, the allergen advisory statement does not mean that a product is contaminated. I have a question about wheat dextrin. Yes, I see that Benefiber is made from wheat dextrin. How can that be labeled gluten-free? Well, dextrin is the sugar of wheat. It's not the protein, and that is a one that I did not address. But wheat dextrin, yes, can be labeled gluten-free. So which foods are not included? Anything with allergen labeling, foods regulated by the USDA are currently not subject to the gluten-free labeling ruling. This includes meat, poultry, and certain egg products. However, the USDA has said that those manufacturers should be using that same standard of less than 20 parts per million that was set forth by the FDA. And the USDA does a good job of looking at many thousand of their labels every year, and they find that most manufacturers are in 80 to 90% voluntary compliance with FDA regulations. And then on to alcoholic beverages. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, those are the TTB for short, governs all of our distilled spirits, our wines that have more than 7% alcohol by volume, and malted beverages like beer that are made with both malted barley and hops. In February 2014, the TTB issued a revision to their interim labeling policy that found that a gluten-free claim cannot be used on a beverage that is made with wheat, rye, and barley. So again, if you see a gluten-free beer, or if you see a beer that is made with wheat, rye, or barley as its starting grain, it cannot have the gluten-free label. Now this gets confusing because of beers like Omission. Omission is a gluten-reduced or a gluten-removed beer. And those are very controversial because, again, they say they have processed that beer to remove the gluten content. And again, that is not necessarily the case. And we'll get on that the next slide. The TTB will allow the statement processed or treated or crafted to remove gluten for products that have gluten-containing ingredients if these products have actually been processed to remove the gluten. But if they use that statement, it has to have another statement that says the gluten content of this product cannot be verified and this product may contain gluten. So I will say, if you have patients who are looking at using gluten-removed beers like Omission or other products out there, that you use caution with those, because again, we cannot necessarily verify the gluten content of those beers. Testing methods are not such that we can definitely confirm those are actually gluten-free. Let's move on to eating away from home. And like I said, most of my patients get a good handle on what's going on in their house most of the time, but when they get out of the house, that's really when things sometimes get tricky. So quality of life studies, and there have been several quality of life studies on those who are on the gluten-free diet, and they find most people cite eating out to be the most difficult thing that they do. An interesting 2012 study that was done by a colleague of mine, Ann Lee, found that many people who had such difficulty eating out sometimes actually would intentionally eat foods with gluten. And of course, that's not what we want them to do. So even if it's infrequent, though, eating foods with gluten can cause continued symptoms and delay intestinal healing. So we don't want them intentionally eating gluten in an eating out situation, but they might do that. They might feel pressure to go ahead and eat just a bite of something, or they don't want to make a spectacle of themselves with the server, or they don't want to have to explain to their friends why they're eating gluten-free, and so they might intentionally consume gluten. And of course, that's a big problem. So when dining out, here are just a few tips that you can help with your patients. So calling ahead is always important, asking about availability of a gluten-free menu, or if the restaurant is able to modify menu items to be gluten-free. But I always say the gluten-free menu does not absolve them of responsibility to ask questions. So it's still important that they ask questions about how things are prepared, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So I always tell them also not to dine at the busiest time. So don't go at 6:30 on a Friday night if that's the busiest time that that restaurant has all week. You're not going to get the personal attention that maybe you're hoping for. Identifying themselves to the server or manager, and depending on your patient's personality, this may or may not be easy for them to do. Some people are very open about their condition and others are much more private. But if they can identify themselves to the server or manager that they need a gluten-free meal, that helps a lot. Using words like severe reaction or even allergy, restaurants are fairly in tune with the word allergy. They don't want somebody getting really sick right in front of everybody. So sometimes even using that word can get them a little bit more attention than just saying, I need a gluten-free meal. Choose a restaurants where items can be made to order and easily modified. So I always think about those fast casual restaurants like Chipotle where you can pick your toppings. Those are things that can be made to order. Is there a way that the gluten-free dish can be easily distinguished from other dishes? So is there a rim around the plate that tells you that that's a gluten-free item? Is there a different color plate that things come out on when it's a gluten-free item? And think about those areas that are most at risk for cross-contact. So prep areas, surfaces, grills, fryers, etc. So like I said, even if there's a gluten-free menu, it's still important for them to ask questions. So for example, in an Italian restaurant, are they using different pasta water? And I honestly, I have not worked in the restaurant business. I was not aware that pasta water was shared. And often even vegetables can be cooked in pasta water. So get boiling waters there and they just put then vegetables in it. So again, that can be a source of contamination. Is there a separate colander available to drain pasta? If they are frying things, is there a dedicated fryer? So they're not doing French fries in the same area or the same fryer as chicken strips. If there's a gluten-free bread available, again, can we separate that from the gluten-containing bread when we're heating it? Separate toppings for things like gluten-free pizza. So are they changing gloves and using fresh toppings out of a bag rather than out of a container on the counter? How is gluten-free pizza separated from other items in the oven? And then how are French fries prepared? Are they prepared in a separate fryer from breaded items? When we talk about kind of a burger restaurant, we talk about a separate area on the griddle where things can be cooked. So rolls and buns not being cooked right next to meat. And if they are going to cook that way for everyone else, is there a way there's a separate area on the griddle can be made, or can they use a clean pan? For example, at our hospital, we typically do our eggs on a griddle, but when we have a gluten-free patient, we go ahead and get a clean pan out and do that in a completely separate area. Be cautious with things like seasonings and marinades. Marinades often contain soy sauce, and soy sauce is a source of gluten. Sauces can be thickened with flour. Salsa, believe it or not, can actually have gluten in it. Sometimes if it has seasonings or smoke flavor, that can have gluten in it. And then verify original stock. Sometimes chicken and beef stock will have gluten in it. So again, if they're adding flour to that. There are helpful resources online. These are just a few of my favorites. Gluten-free Passport is a really cool website. Also a great book. The people who wrote Gluten-free Passport, that website also have a book, which I think is wonderful. Triumph Dining has some nice information, Allergy Eats, and then there are other apps that people can download as well. Other challenging situations, of course, it's about to be wedding season, and folks who are gluten-free often have trouble attending weddings because, again, there's often a meal involved, and sometimes it's requesting a special meal, or in a buffet situation, making sure they get served safely. So ways to talk about that with your patients. So again, either working with the caterer or working with the bride and groom if you know them well to make sure that you can get a safe item. Office lunches and parties, of course, everybody seems to have a birthday all the time, it seems, in offices, and cakes and things come in. This is a tough spot for patients because sometimes they feel left out. They feel neglected by their coworkers if there isn't a gluten-free item. So I encourage, for example, my patients to go ahead and have something available for them. So if you have your gluten-free cookies, or if you know somebody's having a birthday party and you know they're not likely to bring anything that you can have, don't feel left out. You can take something with you to the event. and be a part of the social part of the experience. Religious customs, communion is sometimes an issue for those who are gluten-free. There are low gluten or very, very low gluten communion wafers available for those who are Catholic. That's something that's available online, but you'd want to have your patient talk to their priest before they do that. Other religions may allow people to take a rice wafer, but if they're Catholic, there are actually low gluten communion wafers that are available. Traveling by air or by car, of course, whenever you travel by air, you're very limited in what you can bring on a plane. Same kind of thing here. You talk about what would be safe. I always tell patients, don't expect the airline to feed you in a safe way, so always bring something with you on the plane. Potlucks, of course, holiday parties, and then hospital and extended care facility stays. This is something that nobody wants to think about going to the hospital, but I always tell my patients to be prepared for that. Who to talk to. And of course, I always think that's the RDN's time to shine, is when we can talk about what gluten-free things that we can offer to our patients in the hospital. I work in a really small community hospital, and I have to say, even for the size that we are, I try to keep a decent stock of gluten-free items around. So when the patient comes in, they can at least, for breakfast, have a bowl of safe cereal, and they can have lunch, they can have soup, things like that that they would normally have. And then finally, let's talk about that non-responsive celiac disease. Patients continue, they've been on the gluten-free diet maybe for several months, and they come back to you and they say, you know what, I just don't feel better yet, and I'm wondering what's going on. The most likely cause of what we call non-responsive celiac disease is gluten exposure, and typically that's not intentional, although sometimes it can be. I had a patient come to me once and she said, I'm about 50% gluten-free. Well, that's not good enough. We had to work on that. So inadvertent gluten exposure is the most likely cause, but other food allergies or intolerances could cause people to still not feel well, lactose intolerance, and then we'll talk about FODMAPs here. So of course we know how food allergies are diagnosed. They're diagnosed via skin or blood testing and removal of the allergen. Always best to be diagnosed and managed by an allergist. And then food intolerances. So again, they may be intolerant to some other foods. So we're going to talk about lactose here in a second, but that would be somebody who has negative allergy testing, but again, somebody who has symptoms after eating certain foods. So lactose intolerance is very common in those with celiac disease, and one of the reasons that it's common is that it is secondary sometimes to that villi damage that occurs with celiac disease. So as the person repairs their villi by eating gluten-free and their body and their duodenum begins to repair itself, that lactose intolerance will often go away. It doesn't always go away, but it's something that you can reassure your patient. If they were a milk drinker before, they probably will be able to return to that in time. But avoiding dairy, as we all know, can result in reduced calcium intake and vitamin D intake. And of course, the symptoms of lactose intolerance, if you are lactose intolerant yourself or you know someone who is, can be absolutely miserable. So how do we get a handle on that? We reduce or we eliminate lactose temporarily. We look at reduced lactose products, lactose-free dairy products. Lactase enzymes are gluten-free for the most part. Always check the labels, of course. But then encourage those other dietary sources of calcium, and then of course supplements as necessary. Although I know I'm a big food first dietitian, I'm sure most of you are as well. So again, if we can get a dietary source of calcium, that's better. IBS and celiac disease often go hand to hand, and I think I said at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of patients get thrown under that IBS bus, but it can coexist with celiac disease. It doesn't mean that everybody with IBS has celiac disease, but it is more common in those with celiac disease. And of course, those IBS symptoms, the bloating, the pain, gas, diarrhea, can overlap with those symptoms that we have in celiac disease. A low FODMAP diet, and we'll talk about what FODMAPs are here on the next slide, has been shown to reduce or eliminate symptoms in over 75% of those with IBS. So again, those people who are already gluten-free may also benefit from a low FODMAP diet if they're not feeling better. So a FODMAP is actually an acronym for the words fermentable. So fermentable means it produces gas. oligo, fructones, and oligosaccharides. So those different sugars and short-chain fermentable carbohydrates that are in food. Disaccharides, an example of that is lactose. Monosaccharides, so fructose in excess of glucose, so things like apples and pears. And polyols, so sorbitol, mannitol, and xylitol. So I'm going to give you some examples of what some of those foods are. So of course, we all know what lactose comes from, but fructose, again, apples, pears, watermelon, asparagus, high fructose corn syrup, which of course is in everything, agave syrup, and honey are big sources of fructose. Fructans are found in wheat, rye, inulin, chicory root. If you've been eating any of like the high fiber products, like the Fiber One bars, inulin and chicory root show up in a lot of tricky places now, especially as we have all of these foods that are sort of fiber enhanced now. Kidney beans, baked beans, onion, and garlic. You may have IBS patients who you say that they know they just cannot tolerate onion or garlic, and certain nuts. And then polyols, so sorbitol, mannitol, xylitol, and of course the big bugaboo of xylitol is sugar-free gums and mints and cough drops. It's in a lot of stuff. Cauliflower, pumpkin, and mushrooms. This is not an all-inclusive list of FODMAPs, but these are the general categories. So the low FODMAP diet involves, similar to that gluten elimination diet for non-celiac gluten sensitivity, sort of temporarily restricting all of those high FODMAP foods for a few weeks, depending on the person and depending on the dietitian that you're working with, 2 to 4 weeks. And then we start to reintroduce those different groups. So we might reintroduce lactose first, or maybe we introduce maybe the polyols first, depending on the person. This is best managed by an experienced dietitian in the area of FODMAPs. This is something that I'm personally just getting into working with patients with, and this is a real learning curve. The gluten-free diet is, I always like to say the gluten-free diet is pretty straightforward in what you can and cannot have. FODMAPs is a bit of an art and a science in working with your patient. So if you are interested in FODMAPs, there are wonderful websites out there. There are wonderful authors. Kate Scarlatta and Patsy Katzos are a couple of the US dietitians that I really admire and work with, who have lots of good information on their websites and in books that, if you're getting into FODMAPs, are really good resources for dietitians. The low FODMAP diet is naturally low in gluten. If you remember the previous slide, fructans include wheat and rye, but not all foods on the low FODMAP diet are gluten-free. So these should still be avoided. For example, oats are not high in FODMAPs, but regular oats are typically contaminated with gluten, so they should still be avoided. The other thing to remember is the FODMAP diet is a learning diet, so they should not be on that full, strict elimination diet forever. If they are, that's not good because, again, it's a very restrictive diet and it's not good quality of life. So the goal is for them to have the most liberal, varied diet possible while controlling their IBS symptoms. And again, I always like to say FODMAPs are a bit of an art and a science, and it can take a lot of trial and error working with these patients who have both celiac disease and IBS. So let's put it into practice. We have Mrs. Smith who comes to you. She's had celiac disease for 1 year. She's been very compliant with her diet. You looked at her food records and you say there's really no gluten that you can see that she's intentionally or unintentionally ingesting, but she's still feeling really bad, bloating, constipation, and gas most days. So you look at her food record and it looks pretty standard. She's eating cereal in the morning, but it's gluten-free. She's having milk, yogurt. She's having cheese on her salad at lunch. I think you see where I'm going with this. She's having ice cream at night. She's having almonds and popcorn. So what is the most likely culprit of Mrs. Smith's continued symptoms? And I think we have a poll question here. Yep, most likely lactose intolerance. That's the right answer. Could be FODMAPs as well, because again, lactose is a FODMAP, but most likely we're looking at lactose intolerance. So takeaways for today, and I do appreciate everybody that stayed on. I know time is precious, so I do appreciate you staying with us. strongly encourage that proper testing before starting the gluten-free diet. Again, I can't stress that enough. And I spend a lot of time with patients discussing the fact that even though you think, well, I could just try it and what's the big deal? What's the harm? They can really put themselves in a position they don't want to be in where they don't know what they have. Discourage those use of those unproven tests, discourage the use of ordering things online that can help diagnose quote unquote non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There just isn't anything out there. And then discourage the use of the gluten-free diet to treat other conditions, including weight loss. We have no research studies that show us that gluten-free is beneficial for weight loss. Now, some people say, I lost weight on the gluten-free diet, but I always kind of think, well, you probably ate a lot less junk. If you were a bread eater, if you were a brownie eater and you just stop eating these things, of course you're going to lose weight. But it's not related to gluten. The gluten-free label is a really good thing for patients, and it's a really clear thing, and it's been very nice that now patients don't have to always sort of sift through and confusing ingredients. They can look for that gluten-free label, and it gives manufacturer a standard now to adhere to. Key tips for working with your patients when they eat away from home. So again, that's the most difficult, and you don't necessarily think about it, but whenever you go to a restaurant, you give up control. Whether that is, that you hope the server, doesn't, contaminate your food with illness. Same kind of thing when somebody goes out to eat who has on the gluten-free diet. They're giving up control, and that can be a really difficult thing to do. I have patients, and maybe you do too, who sometimes even just shy away from eating out altogether. And I think, especially if that's been part of your lifestyle, you hate to lose that. And then be aware of other food intolerance, which can cause other continued symptoms. Many times I have gone through food records with patients and just over and over again looking for gluten, thinking gluten was the issue, and it comes out that, for example, maybe they consume a lot of sugar-free gum or breath mints that have xylitol in them, and the xylitol is actually what's upsetting their stomach and not the gluten. And then you have my list of resources. These are pretty small print, but I'm pretty sure, I don't know if I assume that they may be listed someplace else. If not, I'm sure Robin will correct me. And that's all I have. I don't know if we have time for questions or not because we've run over, but I'll let our moderators guide me.
Amy, thank you so much. What a great webinar, and thank you everyone for putting up with all of our glitches in the system and for hanging around for this. As you can see by the interaction in the chat pod, a very hot subject going on now, and lots of good questions. I don't know if we can hang around a little bit longer. If you're up to it, Amy,
yeah,
we can. I'm going
happy to
go through the rest of the slides real quick, and then we can spend a few extra minutes asking questions.
Robin?
Yes.
I know several of our guests have to go. Before all of y'all head out or stick around for questions, if you could just take a brief moment to respond to our affiliation poll, just select the option that best describes your current employment situation. So we'll give y'all about 10 or 15 seconds to complete this before we move into the questions. And Amy, thank you so much for sticking around. I know this is a very hot topic.
Yep.
All right, so just another moment or two to get your response in. All right. Thank you all. All right, Amy, Robin, back to you guys. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Amy, so much, and thank you, everyone, for responding. There were quite a few questions in the chat pod. I know you answered some of them, having to do, some of them I know was having to do with countries, foreign countries, and their how they regulate or label gluten-free diets.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Everybody has a slightly different standard. For example, Canada does not allow oats in any product that are labeled gluten-free, even gluten-free oats. It just depends on the country. But the FDA has said that the standard for imported foods should match. the FDA standard, so less than 20 parts per million. And I really do believe that's one of the reasons the FDA chose the 20 parts per million standard, because it does kind of put us in line with what other countries are doing. But again, everybody has a slightly different standard. Like I said, Canada has slightly different regulations on what can and cannot have the gluten-free label, but they're all generally the same. I did have somebody said they wanted to get the authors that I recommended for FODMAPs. I typed that into the chat pod. The two authors are Kate Scarlata, Scarlata, and Patsy, Patsy, Katsos, Catsos. If you put those into Amazon, there are many books they have written. If you put them into Google, they both have wonderful websites with wonderful resources. And I've had the chance to work with both of them, and they are just tremendous dietitians. Who, like I said, know the FODMAP diets up, down, inside, and outside, and they're wonderful resources, and they will answer your questions. I've emailed both of them before and always gotten answers. They're great ladies to work with. I see another question about how to retesting to make sure celiac is under control after eating the gluten-free diet. I have to tell you, follow-up for celiac disease is really tricky, because depending on the physician, you may have a physician that insists on running the antibody tests every year, and that's probably ideal to rerun those antibody tests to make sure they should be negative. After a certain time. It can take up to 2 years for antibody tests to become negative. It doesn't mean that the person's not eating gluten-free. It just takes time for those antibody tests to come back to normal. But then I have physicians, and I work with them, and you probably work with them as well, who get the person diagnosed with celiac disease and say, okay, see you later, go see the dietitian, and maybe they never get retested or never be monitored for anything. And that's not a good situation. The monitoring and follow-up for celiac disease varies amongst practitioners, unfortunately, and the quality sometimes varies. I do recommend that anybody who has celiac disease, for example, have a bone scan to make sure that their bone density is normal. Be having tests for vitamin and mineral deficiencies, because they may need supplemented. They may need a vitamin D supplement for a short period of time or for a long period of time, depending on the patient. They may need iron supplementation, depending on whether they're anemic. So those follow-ups should be done as well, not just the antibody follow-ups, but nutritional follow-ups to make sure that they are not deficient in any vitamins or minerals. Because if we remember that slide where I talked about some of the grains are not enriched, in fact, most grain products, and so it's an opportunity for people to become deficient. Would you recommend a patient eat out or not with celiac disease? It's tough, but it is something that I think it's a quality of life issue for most people. I mean, I would say most people enjoy eating out, although my patients with celiac disease find it to be a challenge. They want to be able to eat out. They want to feel quote unquote normal. They want to go out with their friends or their coworkers or their family. They don't want to be isolated in that way. So giving them the tools that you can give them and having, training them to ask those questions. And again, depending on their personality, they may or may not feel comfortable identifying themselves to a server or to a manager, but it's really important that they kind of get brave, as I like to say, and say, I really need a gluten-free meal, and then ask those questions and make sure, again, when they bring out that plate, if it's supposed to be on a different color plate, that it's actually on a different color plate, and ask those final questions so they can get a safe meal. Let's see here.
I think that's going to be about all the time we have, Amy.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, I would, if I compile some of these questions and send some of them to you, and maybe I can write them up in a blog, the answers.
I'd love that.
And then we can post them. Okay, that'd be wonderful. Thank you so much for this very informative webinar, and thank you for everyone who's on. Again, the Qualtrics link will be posted on the Learn Event page, and that will be where you can receive your continuing education credit. Okay, now Would love to hear. Nutrition and Wellness is very active on social media, and we would love to hear from you and continue this conversation on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. These links are posted on this slide, and I can post them in the webinar. We hope you will continue to connect with us because this is obviously a very hot topic, and everybody has lots of questions, and there's lots of misinformation out there. We also encourage you to, as an MFL and service provider, such as if you're DoD, branch services, Guard, reserve service providers, and cooperative extension professionals, to continue the discussion on our private and moderated LinkedIn group. Please click the link to join the group, or you can send us an email. We really look forward to hearing from you. And again, here is in order to, we are offering 1.0 CPEU for today's webinar. Please follow the link and you provide your email and credentials, and the certificate will be mailed to you.
Thank you, Robin. Just a heads up, there has been a mix-up, it seems, with the evaluation link, so please just hold off for the moment regarding the link. We're working to put up the correct link on the Learn page. So please check back a little bit later this afternoon to learn.extension.org/events/2832. So we will be sure that we post the correct link, and I'll post that URL to the chat pod. So Renee, yes, that URL that we've just posted, the learn.extension.org, etc. Just check back there this afternoon, and we'll be sure to get that evaluation link so that you can obtain the CPEU for today's event. So thank you again, everyone, so much for staying tuned with us. Amy, thank you so much for your flexibility, and to Robin and the rest of the Nutrition and Wellness team for presenting and supporting today's webinar. Of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email us at milfamln@gmail.com, and we'll get any of those questions answered for you. And also don't forget to check back to the blogs.extension.org link for a wrap-up of all the wonderful questions that that y'all provided today. We wish you a wonderful afternoon, and we will stick on for just a moment or two more if you need to collect any links from the chat pod.